In the depths of a valley long forgotten by time, where the relentless sun beat down mercilessly and the cracked earth pleaded for a drop of rain, there lay a small town of resilient souls. Its inhabitants were men and women hardened by life's cruelties, with calloused hands and eyes burdened by the weight of countless droughts. The sky, once generous, had transformed into an unyielding vault of sorrowful blue, offering no clouds to ease the suffering of those who, day after day, fought to survive. Fields that were once fertile and abundant had become painful memories of better times. The land seemed to have forgotten how to yield its bounty, and the animals, growing ever rarer, roamed the hillsides like ghosts of a lost prosperity. The sound of children at play had been replaced by the heavy silence of hunger, and smiles that once adorned the faces of the community had given way to expressions of exhaustion and despair. Amid this bleak scene lived Joachim, a farmer in his early 40s whose sun-weathered face told the story of a lifetime devoted to tending the soil. His deep brown eyes still held a peculiar gleam, as though harboring the last ember of hope in a world seemingly abandoned by divine grace. He dwelled alone in a modest adobe and thatched house, a legacy from his parents, who had left him nothing but that patch of earth and an unshakable faith in brighter days. Every morning, even before the sun had risen over the horizon, Joachim would be up, kneeling before a small wooden icon representing his patron saint. His prayers, whispered in a hoarse voice made rough by the dry air, asked not for riches or ease, but merely enough to allow him and his neighbors to endure another cycle of trials. Then, armed with his well-worn tools, he would set out for his humble garden plot, battling the aridity of the soil in hopes of coaxing from it some semblance of sustenance. Joachim's life was a silent testimony to perseverance. Even in the toughest days, when hunger gnawed and thirst scorched his throat, he refused to succumb to despair. There was an almost childlike certainty in his heart that even in the darkest hours, a small light would always find a way to shine. It was that very certainty that kept him steadfast while around him many had already surrendered. The community numbered about 20 families, all equally ravaged by scarcity. They were fishermen without fish, hunters without game, and farmers without a harvest. The younger ones, those whose dreams still burned brightly, had departed in search of opportunities in distant lands, leaving behind the elderly, the women, and the children, who now painted a painful picture of abandonment and resilience. Among those who remained was Mrs. Lourdes, an elderly lady whose frail exterior concealed a remarkable inner strength. Widowed long ago, she lived alone in a modest cottage on the outskirts of town. Her children, like many others, had left in search of work in the big cities, and the letters that once arrived with regularity had become as rare as rain in that place. The creases on Mrs. Lourdes' face bore the marks of a lifetime of sacrifice. Her eyes, a faded blue through the passage of time, had seen too many farewells and too much suffering. Yet, like Joachim, she refused to abandon hope. Every day, even with legs weary from age, she would walk to the small town church where she lit a candle and prayed not only for herself but for all who, like her, continued to believe that better days were ahead. That year, however, the drought had intensified beyond anyone's imagination. The wells, which once provided even the minimal water necessary for survival, were drying up one by one. Animals, even the hardiest, began to wither from thirst and hunger. Despair crept into even the bravest hearts like an insidious shadow. It was in this context of extreme hardship that Joachim found himself faced with a dilemma that would mark not only his life, but the history of the entire town. After weeks of toiling in his tiny garden, watering his crops with the little water he managed to draw from an almost dry well, he had managed to harvest only a handful of potatoes and a few small tomatoes, so diminutive that they barely filled his calloused hands. That was all his food, the fruit of so much effort and hope. Seated at the simple table in his home, Joachim looked upon those few morsels with a mixture of gratitude and worry. He knew that if he rationed carefully, they might see him through. A few more days until he could find another way to obtain sustenance. But he also knew he was not the only one suffering the pangs of hunger. That same afternoon, while he contemplated his meager harvest, he heard hesitant knocks at his door. Opening it, he found Mrs. Lurd standing there, her thin frame looking even more fragile under the unrelenting sun. Her once vibrant eyes were now dull from hunger, and her hands, clasping the worn shawl draped over her shoulders, trembled slightly. "Joachim, my dear," she said in a weak voice, "forgive me for bothering you, but I haven't had a single morsel in 3 days. Our neighbors, once so generous, now have nothing to share. I thought perhaps you might—" Her words died on her parched lips, yet her eyes spoke volumes in a silent plea that struck Joachim to his very core. He glanced back at the table where his few supplies lay, then turned again to Mrs. Lurd's. There was no hesitation in his heart, only a deep certainty of what needed to be done. "Please come in, Mrs. Lurd's," he said gently, guiding her by the arm. "I have a little food. It's not much, but we'll share what we have." Seated at the modest table, Mrs. Lurd's gazed with misty eyes at the meager provisions Joachim set before her. They were few, yet in that moment they shone like a priceless treasure. Joachim took a knife and, with an almost reverential care, began dividing the potatoes and tomatoes, reserving the bulk for the elderly woman. "No, my dear," she protested, feebly upon realizing his actions. "You cannot give me more than what you need for yourself. This is the fruit of your hard work and sweat." Joachim smiled, a serene smile that lit up his weary face. "Mrs. Lurd, is in these hard times, the little we have only gains value when shared. What good is it to have food when you know that you suffer from hunger? Besides," he added with a special glint in his eyes, "my mother always said that one who gives generously never runs out." As he spoke, Joachim felt an unusual peace fill his heart. It was as if in that moment of profound scarcity, he had discovered an abundance that transcended the material value of the food before him. There was something sacred about sharing, something that touched the very core of what it meant to be human. With silent tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks, Mrs. Lurds accepted the food offered to her. Her trembling hands, frail from age and emotion, briefly touched Joachim's, in a wordless gesture of gratitude that needed no words. Together, in respectful silence, they shared that simple meal, transforming it into a ritual of communion and hope. After finishing, the elderly woman rose with difficulty, her expression now more animated, as if the nourishment had rekindled not only her physical strength, but also her faith in the goodness of the world. "May God bless you, my child," she said, holding Joachim's hands in hers. "Some people walk this earth leaving deep marks, and you are one of them. Your generosity will not be forgotten, neither by man nor by God." Joachim walked Mrs. Lourdes to her door, embracing her gently and feeling both the fragility of her body and the inexplicable strength of her spirit. Once she departed, he lingered a moment, watching her slowly recede along the dusty road until she vanished around a bend. Returning inside, the farmer glanced at the now empty table. His stomach still ached with hunger, yet his heart was filled with a satisfaction no feast could provide. Kneeling before the small wooden icon, he murmured a prayer of thanks, not for what he had received, but for what he had been able to give. That night, as the sky glittered with stars more brilliant than usual, Joachim fell asleep with a smile on his lips, unaware that his simple act of generosity was about to set in motion a transformation that would transcend all understanding. At dawn the next day, something inexplicable began to occur. Joachim awoke with a strange feeling, as though the very air around him had changed. There was an unusual freshness, a subtle moisture that he had not felt in a long time. Stepping outside, he looked to the sky and saw something that quickened his heartbeat. Small, unmistakable clouds were beginning to form on the horizon. Even more astonishing was what he found in his modest garden. The plants, which the day before had looked wilted and nearly dead, now exhibited a reinvigorated green. The tomatoes he thought he had harvested were reappearing on new vines, larger and redder than before. The potato plants, whose tendrils he had witnessed drying under the unyielding sun, sprang from the ground as if they had been planted weeks ago, vibrant and promising an abundant harvest. Joachim rubbed his eyes, doubting what he saw. He knelt down and touched the plants, feeling the pulse of life within them. It was no illusion. It was real, tangible, and inexplicable. His small garden, which had seemed doomed by drought the day before, now showed signs of vitality that defied all logic. Bewildered and awed, the farmer began gathering the new produce, filling his makeshift shirt like a basket. There was far more than he could consume alone, and as he harvested, a certainty grew within him. This bounty was not meant for him to hoard, but to share. With his arms laden with food, Joachim first made his way to Mrs. Lurdz's house. When she saw him arriving with such abundance, the elderly lady could hardly contain her surprise. "But where did all this come from, my dear?" she asked, her eyes wide at the sight of the copious goods he laid upon her table. "From my garden, Mrs. Lurdz," he replied simply. "This morning, I found everything thriving as if it had been nourished by days of rain. I don't know how to explain it, only that it is a blessing and one we must share." The news spread quickly throughout the town. At first, people were incredulous. Then they became awestruck, gathering around Joachim's house to see with their own eyes the miracle that had occurred. And to everyone's astonishment, it was not just Joachim's garden that was awakened. All over town, plants that had once withered were now sprouting anew, and the once rock-hard earth softened beneath their feet, moist and fertile. As the day wore on, more signs of change emerged. The wind, which had previously carried only dust and desolation, now brought with it the scent of damp earth and promise. The clouds on the horizon multiplied, slowly drawing nearer, laden with the rain that everyone felt was coming. Then, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the rain arrived. Not as a violent storm, but as a gentle, steady shower that fell like a blessing upon the parched land. People emerged from their homes, faces lifted to feel the cool droplets on their weathered skin. Children, who had long forgotten the joy of dancing in the rain, ran through muddy streets, laughing and shouting in a spontaneous celebration of renewed life. Joachim stood silently, letting the rain mix with the tears he could no longer hold back. Deep within, he knew he was witnessing something that transcended human understanding. It wasn't just rain falling from the sky, it was hope. It was renewal, a response to every prayer whispered in desperate nights. The rain persisted through the night, falling with a persistent softness that allowed the earth to absorb every precious drop. When the new day dawned, the town had been transformed. The landscape, once dominated by shades of brown and gray, now boasted patches of green spreading like a living testament to the miracle unfolding. In the days that followed, the transformation continued. The wells that had dried up now overflowed, with clear, refreshing water. The fields once destined for barrenness began to show shoots of every crop that the townsfolk had planted in better times. It was as if the land, after a long period of mourning, had decided to celebrate life once again. The animals that had vanished during the drought began to return. First came the birds, filling the air with songs long absent. Then the small critters, foxes and even deer that could now be seen peacefully grazing on the rejuvenated hillsides. Life, in all its exuberance, was reclaiming its rightful place in that corner of the world once thought forsaken. Yet the most remarkable transformation was not that of the landscape but of the hearts of the people. The miracle that had begun in Joachim's small garden had awakened something within the community, a quality long dormant under the harsh realities of life, the ability to marvel, to believe, to hope. Families that had isolated themselves in their misery now gathered to share meals and stories. The smiles that had once been so rare now shone on faces that had known only pain. In every conversation and communal gathering, Joachim's name was mentioned with reverence and gratitude. And yet, the humble farmer refused to accept any credit for what had occurred. "It wasn't me," he would say simply. "It was the will of God, manifested through a gesture so small that I'm almost ashamed to even mention it. All I did was share what little I had with those who needed it more." Mrs. Lurdz, whose strength and spirit grew with each passing day, was among the few who truly understood the magnitude of what had taken place. One afternoon, as she conversed with several women under the shade of a recently revived tree, she expressed what many felt but few could articulate. "You know, she said, her clear eyes shining with ancient wisdom. The true miracle wasn't the rain or the reborn plants. The real miracle was Joachim's generosity. At a time when everything urged us to close ourselves off and protect what little we had, he chose to open his heart and share. And that is what transforms the world. Not grand gestures, but small acts of genuine love. Her words resonated throughout the small town, stirring hearts and awakening consciences. People began reflecting on their own lives, on how they had reacted in times of adversity. Many felt ashamed upon realizing how fear had driven them into selfishness, concerned only with their own survival. Others wondered what they might have done differently, how they could have been more supportive even amid scarcity. Gradually, something beautiful began to take shape. The community started reorganizing around principles of sharing and mutual support. Community irrigation systems were constructed to ensure that the now abundant water reached every field equitably. Seed banks were established to preserve agricultural diversity and to ensure that no one would be left unable to plant due to a lack of resources. The strong offered their help to the weak, and those with specific knowledge willingly taught anyone eager to learn. Joachim, true to his humble nature, participated in all these initiatives without ever seeking the spotlight. He worked alongside everyone, listening to ideas and offering suggestions when requested, always with the same spirit of service that had defined his entire life. Despite never seeking recognition, the farmer had come to symbolize hope for all. Whenever conflicts arose or someone began slipping back into old, self-centered ways, a mention of Joachim's example was enough to dissolve tensions and renew the spirit of cooperation. One day, about 6 months after what everyone now simply called the miracle began, something unexpected occurred. A group of people arrived in the town, familiar faces that many hadn't seen in years. They were the children, grandchildren, and relatives who had left in search of better opportunities in the big cities. Drawn by the news of the region's incredible transformation, they came to see with their own eyes what once seemed impossible. And what they found exceeded all expectations. In place of the dying town they had left behind, there was now a vibrant community, where life flourished not only in the fields but in the eyes and hearts of its people. Among those returning were Mrs. Lurdz's own children. Seeing their mother looking stronger and healthier than when they had left, they could not hold back their tears. The elderly lady embraced them warmly, her smile lighting up her entire being. "Are you all coming back for good?" she asked, a mixture of hope and fear in her voice. "Yes, Mom," replied the eldest, holding her weathered hands in his. "We're coming back to stay. What we've heard and what we see here, it's more than we ever expected to find anywhere. This isn't just a place to survive, it's a place to truly live." The return of those who had left injected new energy and perspectives into the town. They brought with them knowledge acquired on their journeys, techniques and ideas that, combined with the traditional wisdom of those who had stayed, created previously unimaginable possibilities for sustainable development in the area. Regular meetings were held under the great old tree in the central square, where everyone had a say, and decisions were made with the common good in mind. Young and old, men and women, all participated actively, aware that the town's future depended on everyone's contribution. During one such meeting, the idea emerged to hold a special celebration, marking the first anniversary of the miracle. It would be a moment to express gratitude for the transformation experienced and to reaffirm everyone's commitment to the values that had made this new reality possible. The proposal was met with enthusiastic approval, and soon preparations were underway. Each family volunteered to contribute in some way. Some prepared food, others took charge of decorating, while still others organized cultural performances that revived traditions nearly forgotten during years of hardship. Joachim, as ever, offered to help in the simplest tasks, setting up tables, carrying chairs, and arranging the space. Yet the community had other plans for him. In secret, it was decided that the celebration would also be a tribute to the man whose gesture of sharing his last morsel had sparked the entire transformation. When the great day arrived, the town awoke in a festive mood. Colorful pennants adorned the streets, and the aroma of traditional dishes prepared from the produce of the now fertile earth filled the air. Music long unheard echoed from instruments, rescued from dusty chests, beckoning everyone to the central square where the main celebration was to take place. Joachim, unaware of what awaited him, made his way to the square like everyone else. He was greeted with enigmatic smiles and knowing glances he did not immediately understand. It was only when he reached the center and saw a small, improvised stage with a banner bearing his name that he began to grasp what was happening. No, he protested, attempting to step back. This isn't necessary. I wasn't the one who made the miracle happen. But Mrs. Lourdes, waiting for him alongside the community leaders, firmly grasped his arm. Come, my child, she said softly. No one here is saying you accomplished the miracle alone. We know it was God's grace that visited us. But through your example, we learned the true lesson, that even in our darkest moments, when it seems nothing more can be done, a simple act of love can open the door to the impossible. Reluctantly, Joachim ascended the stage where he was met with warm applause. The entire community was gathered, children with rosy cheeks and lively eyes, a stark contrast to the solemn, despairing faces of just a year ago. The town's mayor, a venerable man who had taken charge during the hardest times and now shared responsibilities with a representative council, took the floor. In an emotional voice, he recounted the familiar story, how a humble farmer, at the height of drought when everyone was fighting merely to survive, chose to share his last meal with a hungry old woman. And it was from that gesture, the mayor concluded, that the miracle was born, transforming not just our land but our hearts. Today we celebrate not only the rain that returned, the plants that grew, and the animals that came back, but the rediscovery of what it means to be truly human, to love, to share, and to believe that hope can always prevail, even in the darkest night. Enthusiastic applause followed his words. Then, several people took turns on stage, sharing personal stories of how Joachim's example had touched them and changed their lives. Finally, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived, Joachim's own address. The farmer, visibly embarrassed by all the attention, hesitated for a moment. Then, in a simple tone, he began, his hoarse voice carrying the sincerity of every word. My friends, he said, I thank you wholeheartedly for this tribute, but I must say I do not deserve it. What I did that day was something any one of you would have done if you were in my place. It wasn't an act of extraordinary courage or kindness. It was simply the realization that we cannot truly live if we do not care for one another. He paused, looking at the attentive faces before him. If there is something to celebrate today, it isn't my gesture but what happened afterward. How all of you came together. How we rediscovered the value of community. How we learned to take care of each other. That is what created the real miracle. That is what transformed our land from a place of desolation into a place of hope. Silent tears glistened on many faces as Joachim spoke. His words carried such profound truth and heartfelt sincerity that they touched everyone deep inside. What I learned over this past year, he continued, is that the miracle does not come from outside. It begins in us, in our ability to love, to believe, to hope against all odds. And when we open ourselves to that inner miracle, the world around us transforms too. A respectful silence followed Joachim's words. Then, as if moved by an unseen force, everyone rose and began to applaud. These were not polite, formal claps, but the genuine expression of hearts acknowledging the deep truth they had just heard. The celebration continued well into the night with music, dancing, and plenty of food. Stories were shared, laughter echoed, and a profound sense of communion filled the air. It was as if on that special night everyone could glimpse a bright future built on the pillars of solidarity, mutual respect, and an unyielding faith in the transformative power of love. As the evening wore on, Joachim found a quiet moment to step away from the crowd. Walking up a small hill on the edge of town, he looked out over the lights and sounds of the ongoing festivities, listening in the distance to the echoes of celebration. His heart overflowed with quiet gratitude for having witnessed and taken part in such a transformation. Noticing his absence, Mrs. Lourdes came to find him. Side by side, they silently observed the spectacle of light and life unfolding below. "You know, Joachim," Mrs. Lourdes finally said, "when I was a little girl, my grandmother told me the story of a man who planted a seed during a drought, when everyone said it was madness. He watered that seed every day with the little water he had. People laughed, saying he was wasting something precious. But he persisted, true to his purpose. And one day, when there was no water left, the plant that grew from that seed began producing water, not just for itself, but for the entire town." She paused, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the moon was beginning to rise. "At the time, I thought it was merely a story, a fable to teach perseverance. But now I understand it was much more, a prophecy of what we are experiencing. You, my dear, were the one who planted the seed of love during a drought. And from your generosity has sprung the water that now nourishes us all." Joachim felt a lump in his throat. Words failed him, so he simply squeezed Mrs. Lourdes's weathered hand in silent gratitude and respect. For a long while they remained, in silence, gazing at a sky now draped in velvety darkness studded with twinkling stars. The night was cool and clear, so unlike the stifling nights of the drought. It was as if nature itself wished to join the celebration, offering its beauty as an extra gift. "I must tell you something, Joachim," Mrs. Lourdes finally whispered. "On that day when I knocked on your door, I had already decided it would be my last. I had no strength left to continue. The hunger, the thirst, the despair were too much. I thought that if even you, the strongest among us, could not help me, then it was a sign that my time was over." Joachim turned to her, shocked. The idea that this woman, so strong and full of faith, might have reached such despair made his heart tighten painfully. "But then," she continued, "you opened your door, and you not only gave me food, but you gave me hope. Your gesture showed me that even in our darkest moments there is still light, that kindness still exists. And that gave me the strength to live again, to wait for the miracle that was to come." Mrs. Lourdes's words fell upon Joachim like a revelation. He had never imagined that his small act, seemingly insignificant, could mean so much. The thought that, unknowingly, he might have saved a life touched him deeply. "Mrs. Lourdes," he finally said, his voice choking with emotion, "it is you who have always given us strength and hope. Your prayers and unwavering faith have been like a beacon in our darkest nights. If anyone planted the seed of hope, it was you long before I even existed." The old woman smiled, a serene, gentle smile that illuminated her lined face. "That is how it works, my dear. Hope and love are like a chain, passing from one person to the next, growing stronger with every link. None of us are merely a giver or a receiver. We are all part of something much larger, something that connects us to one another and to all creation." At that moment, as though to affirm her words, a gentle breeze arose from the valley, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers that now blanketed the once barren fields. It was a sweet yet robust fragrance, much like the very life that had been reborn in that place. "It's time we go back," Mrs. Lourdes said, rising with an agility that belied her age. "The celebration is yours as well, Joachim, and the town will miss you." Together, they descended the hill toward the lights and sounds of the ongoing festivities. As they neared, Joachim observed how the faces of his neighbors shone, not only from the glow of bonfires, but from an inner joy that no adversity could ever dim. He saw children running and laughing, young couples dancing, and the elderly sharing stories with renewed vibrancy. And in that moment, he understood the true miracle that had occurred. It wasn't merely the return of the rain or the regrowth of the land. The real miracle lay in the hearts that had been opened to one another, the rediscovery of the capacity to share, to believe, to hope. It was the miracle of a community that had revived not only from a physical drought, but from the spiritual aridity that had threatened to wither their souls. In the years that followed, the town continued to prosper. Harvests became bountiful. Rain arrived regularly, and the community grew in both number and solidarity. People from other regions, drawn by the stories of the miraculous transformation, came to visit, and many stayed, not only enchanted by the fertile, beautiful land, but also by the spirit of solidarity and cooperation that infused every part of life. Joachim remained the same simple, hard-working man, whose greatest joy was seeing the land bear fruit and his neighbors thrive. He continued tending his expanded garden, now enriched by the help of eager young learners who wished to know his secret. Every day he rose before dawn, prayed before his small wooden icon, and worked with hands that knew every inch of that blessed soil. But something had changed within him. The certainty he always carried, that hope must never die even in the toughest times, had grown into a profound understanding, etched into his very being. He knew now that the abundance of life was not measured by material wealth, but by one's ability to share, to love, and to marvel at the little daily miracles that often go unnoticed. And when the town's children gathered around him, asking him to recount the story of the miracle, he always began in the same gentle way. Once, upon a time, there was a place so dry that its people had forgotten how to love. The tale was always told in the same words, yet it was never quite the same each time. Sometimes Joachim would stress the hunger and despair that had preceded the transformation. Other times, he highlighted the beauty of the rain's arrival, or the sparkle in people's eyes when they rediscovered what community meant. But the ending was always the same, a simple, profound truth etched in his heart on that long-ago day when he shared his last morsel. And so, my little ones, we learned the most important lesson of all, that the greatest miracle is not the rain that falls from the sky or the bread that sprouts from the earth, but the love that is born in our hearts, a love capable of turning even the driest desert into a flourishing garden. For where there is love, there is hope. And where there is hope, there is life. And where there is life, the impossible becomes possible. And when he finished his story, the children would run off to their homes, carrying not just a tale, but a precious seed that, once planted in their young hearts, would ensure that the miracle of the humble farmer who shared his last food would continue to blossom for many generations. A lasting reminder that love is the most powerful force in the universe, capable of transforming not only the land and its harvests, but the very essence of what it means to be human.